Hi, I'm Hannah and I'm 26. I live in Bedford with my husband and foster son. I've been going to church pretty much my whole life. I started at Sunday school at about 4 or 5 years old and now teach kids work and until recently played bass guitar in the band. When I'm not doing my day job in customer service, I love blogging, tweeting, crocheting and baking. So that's a bit about me and my identity. Today I'm going to share with you about the Messiah's identity. Number 1. Messiah's identity. Servant Messiah. In this chapter we have what is almost universally called the first servant song. In this book of Isaiah, one of the key words is servant. In the previous chapter, Isaiah 41, the nation of Israel is also called a servant of God. Israel himself has been called a servant of God. Israel in Isaiah 20 verse 3. However, here in chapter 42, it is as if the phrase servant of God has taken on a new meaning. Someone who is unique, special. God himself is speaking and announcing my servant. By looking further into what God says, we know it cannot be Israel. If anything, Israel is the bruised reed or dimly burning wick. Remember, Israel was to be a light to the nations and reflect God to the whole world. In chapter 41, Israel is described as always complaining resentfully, fearful, discouraged and embittered. Later on in chapter 42, Israel is seen as blind, deaf and disobedient. So this is not an ideal that Israel was to aspire to, but rather one person who would be God's response to Israel's failure and weakness. So what does the rest of the passage tell of the identity of the servant, the Messiah whom God would send? We get a clue in verses 1 to 4. This servant will bring God great delight. This servant will be gentle, quiet, faithful and encouraged. This servant will have God's Spirit upon him. And this shows that the servant will not do anything in his own strength, but rather rely on God's strength to persevere. All the things Israel were to be and do, but had not. Therefore this servant was the opposite of Israel. The key word for this servant is justice. He will bring God's justice to the nation, Isaiah 42 verse 1. Faithfully bring God's justice, Isaiah 42 verse 3, and set in place upon all the earth God's justice, 42 verse 4. Justice in this context is God's restoring order to the whole world against the ravages of sin and decay. Additionally, this servant will be a covenant and a light as he is called out in righteousness. This covenant implies that God will provide welfare for all people, and by the light of this servant shall all the spiritually blind see. The spiritually dead made alive, those captive under the power of sin will be freed, and those in spiritual darkness will see the light. Through this servant, God will reverse all damaging effects that sin has caused the world since it entered into existence way back in Genesis 3. This servant will provide freedom, self-respect and justice for all. Firstly to Israel itself and then to the whole world. Identifying Jesus Christ as this servant. Perhaps the best example to use, looking back with New Testament eyes, is when Jesus was baptized. Jesus went to John the Baptist and presented himself for baptism. John at first refuses to do this. Matthew 3, verses 13 to 15. He knew that if Jesus of Nazareth was a perfect Son of God, who had no need to repent of sin. Through his baptism, Jesus identified with all sinners that he came to save. Why did Jesus get baptized? In replying to John's initial refusal to baptize him, Jesus said, "It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." Matthew 3 verse 15. This looks forward to the cross because it is only through the baptism of suffering that Jesus endured on the cross that God is able to fulfill all righteousness. The us referred to means the Father, Son and Spirit. When Jesus came up from the water, the Father spoke from heaven and identified him as the beloved Son of God, and the Spirit visibly came upon Jesus in the form of a dove. The voice from from God, the Father, ratified Jesus as the Son of God. Not as Son of God, as some may claim, but the one and only Son of God. This harks back to Isaiah 42, where God called the servant a delight, and the Spirit coming upon him.